Close your eyes and let the modern world fade into the frost of a long-forgotten winter. Imagine a time when the only light came from a flickering hearth, and the only sound was the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a clock, a masterpiece of ancient brass and starlight. This is not just a story of a holiday, but a journey through the gears of history, where every tick is a whisper from the past, and every chime is a lullaby for the weary soul. The year is 1796. We find ourselves in a small, coastal village in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, nestled in a landscape that has not yet learned the frantic pulse of the steam engine or the hum of a distant power grid. In this era, time was not a digital countdown, but a seasonal way, a slow, heavy progression measured by the height of the woodpile and the thickness of the ice on the mill pond. As the sun begins its descent behind the jagged silhouettes of the white pine forests, the world enters what the locals call the blue hour. It is a specific, crystalline moment where the sky turns the color of a bruised plum, and the snow, which has been falling in large, lazy flakes since dawn, begins to take on a phosphorescent glow. This is not the slushy, gray snow of a modern city. This is the pure, deep frozen accumulation of a New England winter during the Little Ice Age. To understand the silence of this village, one must first understand what is missing. There are no rubber tires on asphalt. There is no white noise from refrigerators or the invisible vibration of electricity moving through copper wires. The silence here is a physical presence. It is a heavy velvet blanket that muffles the world. If you were to stand on the village common right now, the only sound you would hear is the rhythmic crackle of the freezing air, the sound of moisture turning to ice within the bark of the oak trees, and the distant, hollow thud of a settler's axe miles away. Finishing the day's work, the air itself carries a specific olfactory map of the 18th century. It is dominated by the scent of wood smoke, specifically the sweet, heavy aroma of seasoned white oak and the sharp, resinous tang of hemlock. Every chimney in the village is a localized weather system, sending up a steady vertical plume of gray smoke into the still air. These plumes act as silent indicators of the village's health. As long as the smoke rises, the hearth is alive, and the family within is safe from the encroaching frost. As we move down the main thoroughfare, a rutted track of frozen earth, known as the King's Highway, we see the architecture of survival. The houses are salt boxes, designed with steep, sloping roofs to shed the heavy Atlantic snowfalls. The windows are small, made of crown glass or bullseye glass, hand-blown in circular sheets that create ripples and distortions. If you were to peer through one of these panes, the world outside would look like an impressionist painting. A swirl of blue shadows and flickering orange light from the tallow candles within. In this era, light was a precious commodity. The sun dictated the rhythm of human existence. As the daylight fails, the villagers retreat to the keeping room, the heart of the home. This room is built around a massive central chimney, a monolith of fieldstone and lime mortar that holds the day's heat like a battery. The floorboards beneath your feet are wide planked white pine, worn smooth by generations of wool-stockinged feet. They are cold to the touch, except for the few feet directly in front of the hearth, where the wood is toasted to a deep, resonant amber. The physics of the 18th century frost are fascinating. Inside the homes, the temperature rarely rises above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even with a roaring fire. In the corners of the room, far from the chimney, the breath of the inhabitants hangs in the air like tiny dissipating ghosts. On the window panes, frost ferns begin to grow intricate, fractal patterns of ice that mirror the shapes of the very ferns that will grow in the woods come June. These patterns are formed by the pofu, sublimation of moisture from the cooking pot, and the damp wool coats hanging by the door, freezing instantly against the cold glass. There's a mystery in this cold. Legend in the village speaks of the great stillness of 1796, a winter so profound that the birds were said to freeze mid-flight and the very bells in the church tower became too brittle to ring. But beneath this silence, something else is stirring. In the largest house at the edge of the common, the home of the late horologist, Silas Thorne, there's a sound that defies the winter's grip. It is a sound that shouldn't be there. A rhythmic metallic heartbeat. Tick, tick. It is a sound of unnatural precision in a world of organic irregularities. While the village relies on the sun and the shifting tides, this sound suggests a different kind of time, a mechanical, inexorable progression. It is the sound of the Christmas clock. Though no one has seen it in decades. In the 1790s, a clock was not a mere tool. It was a miracle of philosophy. To the farmers of Massachusetts, a machine that could divide the mystery of a day into 86,400 equal parts was a staggering concept. It represented the Enlightenment's attempt to bring order to a chaotic, frozen wilderness. But Silas Thorne's clock was whispered to be different. It was said to have been constructed not just of brass and steel, but of materials salvaged from an ancient shipwreck, a vessel that had supposedly carried artifacts from the Black Forest of Germany, a place where timekeeping was intertwined with the occult and the alchemist as the frost deepens. The blue hour fades into a true obsidian night. The stars above are terrifyingly bright, undimmed by the light pollution of future centuries. The constellations, Orion the Hunter, the Pleiades, look like diamonds pressed into black velvet. To the 18th century mind, these stars were the grand clock of the heavens, the primary timepiece by which all others were judged. But inside the Thorne estate, the mechanical clock is beginning to sync with the stars. The friction of the gears produces a microscopic amount of heat, just enough to keep the oil from freezing. This oil, rendered from the blubber of a sperm whale caught off the coast of Nantucket, is the lifeblood of the machine. It is clear, odorless, and resistant to the thickening effects of the Massachusetts frost. We imagine the protagonist of our story, a distant relative named Elias, who has just arrived to claim the estate. He stands in the center of the dark hallway, his boots crunching on the thin layer of frost that has crept under the door. He holds a single tin lantern, the flame of the whale wick flickering as he breathes. The silence of the house is absolute, save for that distant, haunting tick. It is a sound that promises a story. A story of how a small village in the New World became the keeper of a secret from the Old World. A story of how, on the coldest night of the year, the gears of history began to turn in a way that defied the laws of physics. As Elias moves toward the sound, the floorboards groan a low, resonant sound that echoes through the empty rooms. The cold is a weight on his chest, but the curiosity is a fire in his mind. He thinks of the stories his grandfather told him about the clock that records the stars, a machine that was said to chime not just the hours, but the very alignment of the planets. The village outside has fallen into its winter sleep. The oxen in the barns are huddled together, their thick hides steaming in the dark. The children are buried under layers of heavy wool quilts and goose-down pillows. The fire in the hearth is burned down to a bed of glowing coals, casting long dancing shadows against the whitewashed walls. Everything is still. Everything is frozen, except for the clock. The mechanism, hidden somewhere in the dark reaches of the attic, continues its steady work. It does not care about the frost. It does not care about the silence. It has a purpose that was set in motion centuries ago, in a workshop across the sea. And as the first chime of the midnight hour approaches, the air in the house begins to vibrate with a low-frequency hum, a sound that signals the beginning of a mystery that has been waiting for the right kind of winter to reveal itself. Sleep now, as the village sleeps. Let the image of the frost-covered windows and the smell of the dying embers fill your mind. We are safe in the 18th century, wrapped in the heavy quietude of the New England winter where time is slow, and the only thing moving is the heartbeat of a clock that knows secrets. We have long since forgotten to enter the attic of an 18th century, New England home is to step into the lungs of the house. It is a space that breathes with the seasons, expanding in the humid summers and contracting into a tight, shivering stillness during the deep winters. As Elias Thorne places his hand on the latch of the narrow door leading to the upper reaches, the metal is so cold it feels almost sticky, a phenomenon caused by the moisture on his skin, threatening to flash freeze against the hand-forged iron. The staircase is a winder, a common architectural feature of the period, designed to take up as little space as possible while acting as a chimney for rising heat. But tonight, there is no heat to be found. As he ascends, the air grows thinner and sharper, smelling of dry rot, ancient cedar, and the peculiar, metallic scent of extreme cold. His lantern, a simple tin cylinder with punched hole patterns, casts 1,000 tiny pinpricks of light against the rough-hewn timber walls. These Paul Revere-style lanterns were never meant for illumination, so much as they were for navigation, guiding a steady hand through a world of shadows. Stepping onto the attic floorboards, Elias hears a groan that seems to travel the entire length of the house. These are king plank boards, some over 20 inches wide, cut from the first-growth white pines that once dominated the Massachusetts wilderness. In 1796, such wide boards were technically the property of the British Crown, intended for shipmasts, but many colonists had defiantly laid them into their floors as a silent act of rebellion. Now they serve as a sounding board for the house's structural fatigue. The attic is a cathedral of joinery. Elias raises his lantern to see the mortise and tenon joints of the roof rafters, held together by wooden treenails or trunnels. There is something deeply meditative about this ancient carpentry. There are no steel bolts here, no modern brackets. The house is held together by the tension of wood against wood, a living puzzle that has survived a century of Atlantic gales. As he moves deeper into the shadows, his light brushes against the detritus of generations. An abandoned spinning wheel sits in the corner, its flax distaff still holding a ghostly tuft of unspun fiber. A stack of tallow dips lies forgotten on a shelf, their waxy bodies turned brittle and white with age. But Elias is not looking for these. He is following the sound. The ticking is louder here. It is no longer a distant heartbeat. It is a localized vibration. It leads him toward the very peak of the gable, behind a heavy wool press and a stack of moth-eaten blankets. There, half buried under a layer of dust that has the consistency of fine gray silk, sits the crate. To a casual observer, it is merely a box. To the boring history enthusiast, it is a masterclass in 18th century logistics. The crate is constructed of European silver fir, a wood not native to the Americas. This immediately marks it as an immigrant, a traveler from the old world. The wood is weathered to a silvery charcoal hue, its surface hewn rather than sawn, meaning it was shaped with an adze or an axe, leaving behind a rhythmic, undulating texture that feels like frozen waves beneath Elias's fingertips. Elias kneels, his knees cracking in a sound that mimics the house's own timber. He reaches out to brush away the dust. This dust is not just dirt. It is a microscopic archive. It contains the linen fibers of 1750, the soot of 1,000 candles, the pollen of long-dead summer hay, and the dander of the barn owls that once nested in the eaves. As he clears the surface, the first mystery reveals itself. The nails. In the late 18th century, nails were a precious commodity. They were not mass-produced in factories, but were drawn by a blacksmith from a nail rod. Elias examines the heads of the nails securing the lid. They are clout nails, with square shanks and rose-head tops, each one bearing the unique hammer marks of the smith who forged them. The rust on these nails is deep and pebbled-rich, burnt orange oxidation that has reacted with the tannins in the wood to create a black, ink-like staining around the holes. This chemical reaction, known as iron gall, is the same process used to make the ink of the era's most famous documents. The nails are not merely fasteners. They are anchors of time, fused into the grain of the fur, but it is the lid itself that arrests his breath. Etched into the wood are inscriptions that defy the utilitarian nature of a shipping crate. These are not the marks of a merchant or a dock worker. They are apotropaic marks, symbols intended to ward off evil or protect the contents from the elements. There is a hexafoil or daisy wheel, a geometric flower drawn with a compass, its 6 petals interlacing in a perfect hypnotic circle. Next to it is a series of VV engravings, often called Marian marks, believed by 18th century craftsmen to invoke the protection of the Virgin Mary, but interspersed with these traditional folk charms are symbols of a more technical, perhaps alchemical nature. Elias traces a line that resembles the astrolabe charts used by early navigators, a circle bisected by a series of precise, degree-marking notches. There is a symbol for Mercury, the planet of movement and transformation, and a peculiar drawing of a clock's escapement wheel, the jagged-toothed gear that controls the release of energy. The inscriptions are deep, carved with a steady hand using a burin or a small chisel. The grooves have been filled with a dark resin, perhaps dragon's blood, or amber, which has preserved the sharpness of the lines against the ravages of the attic air. As Elias moves his lantern, the resin catches the light, glowing with a faint internal fire, as if the symbols themselves are waking up. The crate smells of things far removed from the New England frost. It smells of the black forest of damp earth, crushed pine needles, and the faint, ozonic scent of a mountain thunderstorm. This scent has been trapped within the fibers of the wood for decades, only now being released by the warmth of Elias's proximity. Why was this crate placed here? In the highest, most inaccessible part of the house? In the 1790s, an object of this size and weight, perhaps 200 pounds, would have required a system of pulleys and at least 3 men to hoist into the rafters. It was not stored. It was hidden. It was positioned directly over the main chimney stack, utilizing the stone's thermal mass to ensure the contents remained at a constant, albeit cold, temperature, preventing the delicate internal metals from expanding or contracting too violently. Elias finds a crow's foot pry bar near the wool press, a heavy tool of hand-wrought iron. He hesitates. The boring history of the world is often a history of things left undisturbed. Once a seal is broken, the vacuum of the past is filled by the chaos of the present. But the ticking from within the crate has changed. It has become more insistent, a rapid-fire click-clack that resonates through the floorboards and into the solace of his boots. It is as if the machine inside knows that the stars have aligned, that the blue hour has passed, and that the Christmas Eve cycle is beginning. He positions the pry bar under the lid, near one of the rose head nails. The iron of the tool meets the iron of the nail with a dull, muffled clink. He applies pressure. The sound of the wood groaning is like a long, slow sigh. The fur fibers, dried by 2 centuries of attic air, scream in a high-pitched protest as they release their grip on the nails. Crrrrk, a puff of ancient air escapes the gap, a breath of wind from 17th century Germany. Smelling of linseed oil and polished brass, Elias pauses, allowing his heart rate to slow. In the silence that follows the crack of the wood, the attic seems to expand. The shadows in the corners seem to lean forward, curious. He thinks of the master clockmaker in the Black Forest, his hands stained with oil, his eyes squinting by the light of a tallow lamp as he hammered these very nails. He thinks of the voyage across the Atlantic, the crate lashed to the deck of a wooden brigantine, sprayed with salt crust, tossed by the same gales that now rattle the shutters below. He applies pressure again. The second nail gives way. Then the third dot as the lid begins to tilt. Elias sees the first glimpse of the Christmas clock. It is wrapped in oilcloth heavy linen soaked in boiled linseed oil and wax to make it waterproof. The cloth is stiff and yellowed, looking like the skin of a prehistoric creature. But even through the cloth, the shape is unmistakable. It is tall, imposing, and possesses a skeletal complexity that makes the surrounding 18th century furniture look crude. Beneath the oilcloth, something glimmers. Not the dull reflection of iron, but the deep, honeyed gold of high-quality brass, Prussian brass, known for its high zinc content and its ability to hold an edge for centuries. Elias realizes that this crate is not just a container. It is a sarcophagus for a living idea. The inscriptions on the lid were not just for protection. They were a manual, a warning, and a prayer. He traces the final symbol at the edge of the wood, a small, delicately carved hourglass, but with the sand flowing upward instead of downward dot in the world of boring history. Such a symbol represents the Great Return, the idea that time is not a straight line leading to an end, but a circle that returns to its beginning dot. As Elias prepares to lift the oilcloth and reveal the face of the clock, he feels a strange sense of peace. The cold of the attic no longer bites. It feels like a preservative, a quiet medium in which history can exist without decaying. The ticking inside the crate is now a rhythmic lullaby, steady and sure, promising that no matter how much the world outside changes, the gears within will always know their way home. To understand the heartbeat of the clock, Elias Thorne discovered in a freezing New England attic. We must travel back through the corridors of time across the churning gray Atlantic, over the lowlands of Europe, and deep into the emerald shadows of the Schwarzwald, the Black Forest of Germany. The year is 1582, a time when the world was gripped by a different kind of winter, and the very definition of time was about to be rewritten. In the 16th century, the Black Forest was not merely a forest. It was a fortress of wood and mist. It was a place where the trees grew so densely that the sun rarely touched the forest floor, and the inhabitants lived by the rhythm of the axe and the furnace. Here, the boring history of horology begins not with a factory, but with the slow, patient observation of the stars and the meticulous harvesting of mountain minerals. We find ourselves in the workshop of Master Johannes von Zeller. To visualize this space is to see a room where the boundaries between science, art, and alchemy dissolve. The air is thick with the scent of pine pitch, used to seal windows, against the mountain drafts and the metallic tang of charcoal fires. On the walls hang vellum blueprints, made from stretched calfskin, covered in the intricate geometry of the Renaissance. In 1582, the world was in a state of chronological chaos. Pope Gregory XIII had just introduced the Gregorian calendar to replace the aging Julian system, which had drifted 10 days off course. This meant that across Europe, 10 days simply vanished from the record. For a master clockmaker like von Zeller, this was a profound spiritual and mathematical crisis. If the calendar could fail, then time itself was a slippery, elusive thing. He became obsessed with creating a constant, a machine that would not merely follow a human calendar, but would sync perfectly with the great clock of the heavens. The blueprint for the Christmas clock was not drawn with a simple pen, but etched with a silver point stylus. Von Zeller used the golden ratio, $1.618, as the foundational proportion for every gear and spindle. In his philosophy, which blended the mathematics of Euclid with the chemistry of Paracelsus, a clock was a microcosm. If the gears were perfectly proportioned to the movements of the planets, the clock would theoretically never lose a second. Even as the mountains crumbled into the sea, let us consider the boring but beautiful details of the materials von Zeller chose. He did not use common iron, which was prone to the red rot of rust. Instead, he sought out rose brass, a specific alloy of copper and calamine ore found only in the Rammelsburg mines. This brass had a high zinc content, giving it a deep, reddish gold hue and a structural density that allowed for teeth so fine they could barely be seen by the naked eye. The casting process was a ritual of patience. Von Zeller would melt the copper in a graphite crucible, heating it until it reached a cherry red glow approximately. $PC key zirk. Text, see dollar before adding the calamine. As the metals fused, the workshop would fill with a pale, ghostly green flame, the philosopher's wool or zinc oxide rising in a shimmering mist. This was the alchemical moment, the transformation of raw earth into a golden medium capable of holding time captive. The blueprint spread across von Zeller's workbench detailed something far more complex than a standard verge and foliate escapement. The Christmas clock was designed with an astronomical orrery at its heart. This was a series of concentric brass rings that tracked the precession of the equinoxes, the slow, 26,000-year wobble of the Earth's axis. To achieve this, von Zeller had to calculate differential gearing, a concept that was centuries ahead of its time. He spent 3 winters doing nothing but calculating the tooth counts for the gears. One gear, intended to represent the movement of Saturn, was designed to rotate only once every 29.5 years. As we dwell on the technicality of these gears, imagine the sound of von Zeller's workshop. It is a slow, rhythmic symphony. The rasp of a fine-toothed file against the brass, the hiss of a quenching bucket, the thud of a wooden mallet seating a spindle. There is no rush. In the 16th century, a masterpiece could take a decade to complete. The clockmaker's life was tethered to the object he created. His heart rate and his breathing eventually synchronized with the steady tick-tock of his prototypes. The Christmas aspect of the clock was born from von Zeller's fascination with the winter solstice. In the Black Forest, the solstice was the hinge of the year, the moment when the darkness was at its deepest and the light began its slow, agonizing return. Von Zeller designed a 13th gear, a hidden mechanism made of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver. This gear was programmed through a series of cams to engage only once every 365 days. Specifically during the 12 days of Christmas, when this gear engaged, it shifted the clock's strike train from a simple bell to a carillon of glass. Von Zeller had commissioned glassblowers from the nearby village of Wolfach to create 12 tiny, pressurized glass spheres, each tuned to a specific musical note. When the clock struck the midnight hour on Christmas Eve, a series of velvet-tipped hammers would strike these spheres, creating a sound that was described in local legends as the singing of the stars. But why was this called an alchemist's blueprint? In the 1580s, alchemy was the precursor to chemistry. It was the belief that all matter was interconnected. Von Zeller believed that by using polarized lodestones, natural magnets within the pendulum bob, he could tie the clock to the Earth's magnetic field. This would, in theory, account for the gravity drift that plagued early timepieces. To a modern physicist, this is a fascinating exploration of early magnetic theory. To a sleeping listener in the 21st century, it is a soothing image of a clock, literally tethered to the heart of the planet. The blueprints also contained steganographic messages, hidden meanings within the drawings. The decorative scrollwork on the clock's face was actually a map of the constellations as they appeared over the Black Forest in the year 1582. If you knew how to read the petals of the engraved flowers, you could calculate your exact longitude. It was a survival tool disguised as an ornament. As von Zeller neared the end of his life, the clock remained in his mountain workshop, a ticking monument to his genius. He never intended for it to be sold. He viewed it as a legacy of the silent hours. He wrote in his journal, the very journal Elias would later find, that time is not a predator that consumes our lives, but a river that carries us back to the source. This clock is the boat. The transition of the clock from the German mountains to the New England coast is a story of survival. During the 30 Years' War, as villages across the Black Forest were engulfed in conflict, the clock was dismantled. Each gear was wrapped in parchment, soaked in beeswax, and buried in a wooden chest beneath the floorboards of a monastery. It stayed there for over 100 years, a silent witness to the passage of history, until it was rediscovered by a traveling merchant, an ancestor of the Thorn family who recognized the rose brass and the hexafoil. Marks of von Zeller. Imagine the clock in its disassembled state. Hundreds of brass teeth, silver spindles, and glass spheres, all waiting in the dark. It was a jigsaw puzzle of the Renaissance, carrying the DNA of 16th century science into a new world. When it finally reached America in the late 1700s, it brought with it the quietude of the Black Forest, a frequency of time that was slower, deeper, and more aligned with the stars than the frantic world of the Industrial Revolution would ever be. As you drift closer to sleep, visualize the master's workshop one last time. See the silver point drawings glowing in the candlelight. Hear the steady, rhythmic filing of the brass. Feel the ancient mountain cold pressing against the window panes. The Christmas clock is no longer just a machine. It is a bridge. It connects the 16th century alchemist to the 18th century colonist, and finally to you, lying in the quiet of your own room. The gears are turning. The lodestone is pulling. The stars are in their proper alignment. Everything is precisely where it should be. The lid of the crate has been set aside, leaning against a stack of 18th century wool blankets. Elias Thorne stands over the open container, his tin lantern held low. The light flickers, casting long rhythmic shadows that dance across the rafters of the attic. Before him lies the Christmas clock, still partially swaddled in its yellowed oilcloth. As he begins to peel back the fabric, the first thing that greets him is not a sight, but a scent, a heavy, multi-layered aroma that serves as a sensory map of the machine's history. It is the scent of aged cedar wood, specifically Cedrus libani, the cedar of Lebanon. In the 1700s, master horologists often lined their most precious clock cases with this wood, because its natural oils acted as a deterrent to the death watch beetle and other wood-boring insects that could compromise the structural integrity of a timepiece. The scent is dry, resinous, and deeply grounding. Beneath it lies the sharper, more industrial tang of sperm whale oil. This oil, harvested from the deep-sea giants of the Atlantic, was the only lubricant of the era that maintained its viscosity in the sub-zero temperatures of a New England winter. It smells of the sea, of ancient organic chemistry, and of a world that functioned on the literal lifeblood of the natural world. As the oilcloth falls away, the anatomy of the masterpiece is revealed. It is a long case or grandfather clock, but its proportions are slightly skewed, following the more ancient, slender aesthetic of the German Renaissance. The case is a triumph of 18th century joinery. Elias runs his fingers over the dovetail joints at the base. These are not the perfect, machine-cut joints of the modern era. They are hand-sawn, with slight variations in the width of the pins and tails, showing the mark of a craftsman's chisel. The wood has been polished with a mixture of beeswax and turpentine, creating a patina, a microscopic layer of oxidation and wear that gives the cedar a glow like dark honey. The pendulum. The heart of gravity. Elias reaches into the belly of the clock to examine the pendulum. In the world of boring history, the pendulum is perhaps the most significant invention in human timekeeping. Before the pendulum, clocks were erratic, losing up to 30 minutes a day. With the introduction of the pendulum, time became a science of gravity. The pendulum bob of the Christmas clock is a massive disc of rose brass, nearly 10 inches in diameter. It is surprisingly heavy, weighing approximately 15 pounds. This weight is crucial. A heavier bob is less susceptible to the air drag and minute vibrations of the house. Inside the brass shell, as described in von Zeller's alchemical blueprints, lies a core of lead and lodestone. The physics of this pendulum are hypnotic to consider. It is a seconds pendulum, meaning its length is precisely calculated so that each swing or oscillation takes exactly 1 second. According to the formula for a simple pendulum, $t equals 2 pi skirt, fracca, lugd, where $L is the length and $G is the acceleration of gravity. In the latitude of Massachusetts, this requires a rod of approximately $39.10 inches. Elias observes the rod itself. It is not made of wood, but of a bimetallic strip of steel and brass. This was a revolutionary 18th century solution to the problem of thermal expansion. In the freezing attic, a simple iron rod would contract, shortening the pendulum and making the clock run fast. By layering two metals with different expansion coefficients, the pendulum self-compensates, maintaining its exact length regardless of whether it is the heat of July or the frost of December. This is the boring history of precision, the invisible struggle against the laws of thermodynamics. The train of wheels, a symphony of gears moving upward. Elias opens the hood of the clock to reveal the movement, the mechanical brain of the machine. Here, the anatomy becomes a forest of brass. The movement is a weight-driven system, powered by two heavy lead canisters suspended by braided silk cords. These weights provide a constant, unrelenting torque, a physical manifestation of potential energy being converted into the measurement of seconds. The great wheel, the largest gear in the train, is a masterpiece of hand cutting. In the 1790s, gear teeth were not stamped. They were divided using a sector and cut one by one with a dividing engine. Elias counts the teeth. There are 96, each one shaped into a cycloidal curve. Note for the curious: a cycloidal tooth is shaped like the path a point on a circle takes as it rolls along a straight line. This specific shape ensures that as the gears mesh, they roll against each other rather than sliding. Sliding creates friction. Rolling creates longevity. It is why this clock, despite being over 200 years old, shows almost no wear on its contact surfaces. The gears are mounted on arbors axles of polished, crucible steel. These arbors do not sit in modern ball bearings. Instead, they rest in bone bushings. This is an ancient technique where the holes in the brass plates are lined with polished ox bone. Bone is naturally porous and holds the whale oil in microscopic reservoirs, providing a self-lubricating surface that is almost as hard as stone. The contrast between the golden brass, the white bone, and the silver steel is a visual lullaby of industrial harmony. The deadbeat escapement, the pulse of time. At the very top of the gear train sits the most mysterious component, the escapement. This is the mechanism that converts the circular motion of the gears into the back and forth swing of the pendulum. The Christmas clock uses a deadbeat escapement, invented by Richard Graham in the early 1700s. As Elias watches, the Simkeep wheel, a gear with sharp, hooked teeth, advances one notch. Tick, a small steel pallet catches the tooth, stopping the entire machine for a fraction of a second. The pendulum swings, the pallet lifts, and the wheel advances again. Tock. This is the pulse of the house. The deadbeat design is called such because the seconds hand does not recoil or jitter. It moves with a definitive, dead stop. It is the sound of absolute certainty. In the silence of the attic, the sound of the escapement is magnified by the cedar case, which acts as a sounding board. The hollow, woody resonance of the tick-tock is rhythmic enough to synchronize a person's breathing. The complications. The moon and the stars. Behind the main dial of the clock lies the motion work, the additional gears that drive the complications. The Christmas clock does not just tell the hour and minute. Above the 12, there is a lunar aperture. This is a rotating disc painted with lapis lazuli pigment, representing the night sky. On it are two hand-painted moons, their faces rendered in gold leaf. The disc is geared to rotate once every $29.50 days, the exact length of a synodic month. This allowed the 18th century owner to know, without looking outside, whether the night would be bright enough to travel by horseback or if the new moon would leave the roads in pitch darkness, but deeper still. Tucked behind the lunar disk are the gears for the orrery. These are the gears von Zeller calculated in his Black Forest workshop. They are made of speculum metal, a brittle but highly reflective alloy of copper and tin. These gears move so slowly that their motion is invisible to the human eye. The Saturn gear, with its hundreds of microscopic teeth, moves only a few millimeters a year. It is a machine that operates on a geological timescale, a reminder that while human lives are measured in minutes, the universe moves in a eons. The tactile reality Elias reaches out to touch the winding square. He feels the coldness of the brass. It is a dry, solid cold. He thinks about the inertia of the machine. To start this clock is not as simple as flipping a switch. It requires a physical engagement with the weights. He takes the crank key, a heavy iron tool with a wooden handle, and fits it into the winding hole dot as he turns the key. He hears the click work. This is the sound of the ratchet and pawl assembly. Clack dash clack dash clack. It is a sturdy, reassuring sound. He is lifting the 15-pound lead weights, storing energy for the coming week. He can feel the tension in the silk cords, the way the fibers stretch and settle. Everything about the clock is real. There are no shortcuts. Every ounce of weight, every degree of the gear's curve, and every drop of oil has a specific historical purpose. It is a masterpiece of mechanical realism. In an age of digital abstractions, the Christmas clock is a grounding force, a collection of earthbound materials, wood, metal, bone, oil organized by the highest principles of 18th century mathematics. The final detail. The snail Camus Elias prepares to set the time. He notices one final anatomical detail, the snail cam for the striking mechanism. It is a spiral-shaped piece of brass that determines how many times the hammer strikes the bell. In the Christmas clock, this cam is uniquely shaped. It has a 13th step, an indentation that remains unreachable for 364 days of the year. This is the secret of the Christmas clock. Only when the 13th gear from von Zeller's blueprint engages on the solstice does the rack drop into this deepest notch, allowing the clock to perform its miraculous once-a-year chime. Elias closes the hood of the clock. The cedar scent is now revitalized, stirred up by the movement of air. The machine stands before him like a silent sentinel. It is heavy, it is ancient, and it is perfectly balanced. As you listen to the description of these gears, the rolling of the cycloidal teeth, the slow swing of the bimetallic pendulum, the steady drip of the whale lil, let your mind settle into the rhythm of the machine. You are no longer in the 21st century. You are in the blue hour of 1796, in an attic of echoes, where the only thing that matters is the next tick, and the one that follows it. The anatomy of the clock is a map of peace. It is a world where everything fits, where every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and where time is not something to be chased, but something to be observed, one slow, heavy second at a time. As Elias Thorne stands in the silence of the attic, the rhythmic ticking of the Christmas clock begins to feel less like a machine and more like a heartbeat, one that has been beating for centuries, waiting for the specific alignment of the earth and the stars. In the village of 1796, stories about the 13th chime were whispered by the fireside, often dismissed as the superstitions of old men or the overactive imaginations of children. But to a horologist, the 13th chime isn't a ghost story. It is a mathematical inevitability. To understand the legend, we must first look at the boring history of how humanity has tried to tether itself to the cosmos. Long before the first brass gear was ever filed, our ancestors used the world itself as a clock. They used the gnomon, the simplest of all timepieces, a vertical pillar that cast a shadow upon the earth. By tracking the length and angle of that shadow, they didn't just tell the time of day. They tracked the journey of the sun through the zodiac, the winter solstice, the night this clock was built to celebrate, has always been the most significant tick in the grand clock of the universe. In ancient Egypt, the priests of Ra watched the merhit, an astronomical tool consisting of a plumb line and a sighting slit to track the transit of stars like Sirius. In the British Isles, the builders of Newgrange constructed a passage tomb so precise that, for 17 minutes on the morning of the winter solstice, a single beam of light penetrates 60 feet into the darkness of the stone chamber, illuminating the ancient carvings within. This was the first 13th chime, a celestial alarm clock signaling that the sun had reached its lowest point and was ready to begin its return. The geometry of the 13th gear within. The Christmas clock. Von Zeller translated this ancient stone and light wisdom into the language of metal. The legend of the 13th chime refers to a hidden mechanism known as the star gear or the anniversary wheel. Most clocks operate on a 12-hour or 24-hour cycle. However, the Christmas clock contains a differential gear ratio that is staggering in its patience. Deep within the movement, tucked behind the main pillar plate, is a wheel with 365.25 teeth. This gear is advanced only once every 24 hours by a single trip lever connected to the hour wheel. For 364 days of the year, this gear turns invisibly, its movement so slow that it would appear stationary to the human eye. But on the night of the winter solstice, the moment the sun enters the sign of Capricorn, this gear reaches a specific gate. In the boring history of horology, this is what we call a programmed cam. The cam is shaped like a nautilus shell. As the year progresses, a follower arm slowly climbs the curve of this shell. At exactly midnight on December 24th, the arm reaches the very peak of the curve and drops into a deep, vertical notch. This drop releases a secondary weight, a small, 3-pound cylinder of silver heavy lead that has been hanging dormant for a year. This weight provides the sudden burst of energy required to engage the carillon of glass that von Zeller commissioned in the Black Forest. The 12 days and the intercalary gap, the folklore of the village, suggests that the 13th chime represents a time outside of time. This is rooted in a very real historical problem: the discrepancy between the lunar year and the solar year. A lunar year, 12 cycles of the moon, is approximately 354 days. A solar year is 365 days. This leaves an 11-day gap, the 12 days of Christmas. In ancient European folklore, these days were seen as a bridge where the normal laws of nature were suspended. It was a period of intercalary time. The Christmas clock was designed to keep this gap. The 13th chime was intended to vibrate at a frequency that symbolized the harmony between the moon and the sun. The villagers whispered that if you stood close enough to the clock when it struck 13, you could hear the music of the spheres. In reality, what they were hearing was the resonance of the glass carillon, because the bells were made of pressurized glass rather than cast bronze. Their overtones were pure and lacked the discordant beating found in metallic bells. When struck, they produced a long decay tone that could last for nearly a minute. If the clock struck 13 times in rapid succession, the overlapping vibrations of the glass would create a standing wave, a physical sensation of humming in the air that felt, to the 18th century mind, like a miracle. The celestial alignment of 1796. As Elias brushes the frost from the clock's face, he realizes that the winter of 1796 is no ordinary winter. In the boring history of astronomy, this year featured a rare, great conjunction. The planets Jupiter and Saturn were moving toward a close alignment in the night sky. Von Zeller's blueprints suggested that the clock was sensitive to these planetary positions. The pendulum bob, with its lodestone core, was designed to react to the minute changes in the Earth's magnetic field changes that some ancient scientists believed were influenced by the positions of the heavy outer planets. Imagine the technical beauty of this. A machine that is so finely tuned that it feels the weight of the solar system. As Jupiter and Saturn pull on the Earth, the magnetic drag on the pendulum shifts by a fraction of a millimeter. The Christmas clock was designed to read this shift. The 13th chime was not just a celebration of Christmas. It was a notification that the Earth had successfully completed another lap around the sun. Guided by the invisible hands of gravity. The folklore of the village in the village of 1796. The clock was known as the peace bringer. It was said that during the years the clock was wound and ticking. The harvests were more bountiful and the winters less harsh. This is a classic example of historical correlation. When a community has a central, reliable timepiece, their lives become more synchronized. They plant together, they harvest together, and they rest together. The mystery of the clock was actually the success of its precision, but there was one darker legend. It was said that Silas Thorne, the clock's previous keeper, had once tried to force the 13th chime to occur on a night that was not the solstice. He had tried to manually advance the anniversary wheel. The legend says the clock resisted. The brass gears, built with such exact tolerances, seized up. The glass bells remained silent. Silas was found the next morning, not dead, but in a state of deep slumber, from which he didn't wake for 3 days. This story served as a warning to the villagers. You cannot hurry time. You cannot force the seasons. You must wait for the gear to turn, for the weight to drop, and for the stars to align. The rhythmic transition to sleep. Elias sits on a low wooden stool, his back against a cedar beam. He watches the pendulum, left, right, left, right. The sound is a boring history lullaby. It is the sound of the Egyptians watching the shadows. It is the sound of the Druids waiting for the sun at Stonehenge. It is the sound of von Zeller's file against the rose brass. It is a sound that says, everything is in order. The year is ending. The light is returning. You are safe in the flow of time. As the blue hour turns into the midnight hour, the anniversary wheel of the Christmas clock is only a few teeth away from the notch. The follower arm is at the very edge of the nautilus shell. The potential energy in the silver lead weight is humming, a silent tension waiting to be transformed into music. Elias closes his eyes. He doesn't need to see the gears to know they are moving. He can feel the intercalary gap opening up. The village is silent. The frost is thick. The stars are bright. And deep within the clock, the 13th gear, the gear of the ancients, the gear of the alchemists, is preparing to take its one and only step of the year. The clock does not merely record the passing of minutes. It records the position of the soul within the cosmos. As Elias Thorne carefully adjusts the side panels of the clock's hood, a secondary mechanism is revealed, a hidden stage behind the primary dial. This is the orrery, a mechanical model of the solar system that was the height of both scientific achievement and artistic devotion in the late 18th century. In the boring history of science, an orrery named after Charles Boyle, the 4th Earl of Orrery, was more than a toy for the wealthy. It was a physical manifestation of the harmonia mundi, the belief that the universe operated like a perfect, divinely wound machine. For Elias, standing in the freezing New England dark, the sight of the porcelain planets is a staggering contrast to the rough-hewn timbers of the attic. The porcelain spheres, minutiae of the heavens. The planets of this orrery are not made of brass or wood. They are crafted from Meissen porcelain, often referred to in the 1700s as white gold. To create these spheres, Johannes von Zeller had sent specifications to the master kilns in Saxony. Each planet is a tiny, hollow globe of kaolin clay, fired at temperatures exceeding $1,300 circ tactile, achieve a translucency that allows them to catch the dim lantern light and glow from within. Elias peers closer. his breath hitching as he sees the detail. These spheres were painted by a miniaturist, a craftsman who likely used a brush, made from a single hair of a sable's tail. Mercury is a tiny mottled orb of slate gray and silver leaf, positioned closest to the central sun. Venus is a creamy, pearlescent white, glazed with a subtle iridescent sheen that mimics its thick, reflective atmosphere. Earth is a masterpiece of 16th century cartography rendered on a marble-sized scale. You can see the jagged coastline of the New World and the deep, lapis lazuli blue of the Western Ocean. Mars is colored with cinnabar, a deep, earthy red that seems to pulse with a low volcanic energy. The central sun is a polished sphere of gilded brass, surrounding which all these porcelain worlds revolve. In the 1790s, the heliocentric model of Nicolaus Copernicus was well established in scientific circles, but to see it rendered in mechanical motion was still a profound experience. It represented a shift in human consciousness, the realization that we are not the center of the universe, but passengers on a magnificent, ticking voyage through the void. The epicyclic gearing, the math of the spheres, the boring history of this orrery lies in the differential gear train that drives it. To move the planets at their relative speeds requires a mathematical complexity that borders on the miraculous. Consider the Earth-Moon assembly. The Earth sphere must rotate once every 24 hours, while the tiny ivory-carved moon must revolve around the Earth once every 27.3 days, the sidereal month. To achieve this, von Zeller used epicyclic gearing gears that rotate around other gears. Technical detail: imagine a large, stationary gear called the sun gear. Around it, a smaller planet gear orbits, held by a carrier arm. As the carrier arm moves, the planet gear is forced to rotate by its contact with the sun gear. By carefully selecting the number of teeth on each gear, the clockmaker can simulate the elliptical orbits discovered by Johannes Kepler. Elias watches as the mechanism performs its silent work. There is no grinding, no friction. The gears are so finely polished that the movement of the porcelain Earth is as smooth as the flow of water. The Saturn sphere, located at the furthest reaches of the orrery's arms, features a set of rings made from a thin shaving of mother-of-pearl. It moves so slowly that its motion is a test of human patience, a reminder that in the 18th century, time was measured in seasons and lifetimes, not seconds and clicks. The equation of time, solar versus civil. As a student of horology, Elias notices a specific cam located beneath the orrery's base. This is the equation of time cam, shaped like a lopsided kidney dot in the boring history of timekeeping. There are two kinds of time: apparent solar time, the time shown by a sundial, and mean solar time, the steady time shown by a clock. Because the Earth's orbit is an ellipse and its axis is tilted, the sun actually appears to run fast or slow by up to 16 minutes at different times of the year. The Christmas clock is a musical equation clock. The kidney-shaped cam tracks this discrepancy. As it rotates once a year, it moves a small offset lever that adjusts the clock's minute hand to match the true position of the sun. It is an act of supreme honesty. The clock acknowledges that human-made time is a fiction, and it constantly corrects itself to align with the real time of the solar system. The winter solstice alignment tonight. On the eve of the winter solstice, the orrery is reaching a critical configuration. The Earth sphere is tilted at its maximum angle away from the central gilded sun, representing the deep winter of the northern hemisphere. The village of 1796 is currently in shadow, but the orrery shows the big picture. It shows that while the villagers are shivering in their beds, the Earth is beginning its turn. The solstice gear, a wheel with a single elongated tooth, is hovering just millimeters away from the release pole. When this tooth makes contact, it doesn't just chime the hour. It unlocks the star map. Small door at the very top of the clock's arch slides, open to reveal a nocturnal, device for telling time by the stars of the Big Dipper and the North Star. The clock is literally pointing the way through the night. The sensory experience of the stars. Elias sits back, his lantern light reflecting off the porcelain planets. The attic is no longer a dusty storage space. It is an observatory. The smell of the cedar and whale oil mingles with the cold, creating a scent that feels universal. He thinks of the ancient navigators, the Phoenicians and the Polynesians, who moved across the trackless oceans using the same alignments now captured in this brass and porcelain cage. He thinks of the alchemist von Zeller, who believed that by building this orrery, he was creating a tether that would keep the human spirit from drifting away in the darkness of the Black Forest. The ticking of the clock has changed its tone. It is no longer a sharp click. It is a resonant thrum. This is the sound of the heavy planetary arms moving in unison. It is a low-frequency vibration that you don't hear with your ears, but feel in your chest. It is the heartbeat of the heavens. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the porcelain earth rotating slowly in the dark. See the silver rings of Saturn shimmering in the candlelight. Feel the weight of the equation cam as it corrects the path of the hands. You are part of this alignment. Your breathing is slowing down, matching the rhythm of the seconds pendulum. The world is large. The stars are distant, but the clock is holding everything together in a perfect, mechanical embrace. The planets are in their places. The sun is waiting behind the horizon. The gears are meshed, and the great 13th chime is drawing closer with every steady planetary tick. To understand the atmosphere surrounding the Christmas clock in the year 1796, we must descend from the cold, celestial heights of the attic and return to the keeping room, the warm, rhythmic heart of the colonial home. In this era, in the rugged landscape of New England, Christmas was not the exuberant, neon-lit spectacle we know today. It was a season of the great quiet. For many, influenced by the lingering austerity of Puritan ancestors, it was less a day of revelry and more a period of deep, sensory-rich reflection and preparation for the lean months of midwinter. The architecture of light, tallow and beeswax as the sun disappears by 4 in the afternoon. The village enters a state of optical intimacy. In 1796, light was something you created with your own hands. The boring history of colonial illumination is a study in textures and melting points. Most homes relied on tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, mutton or beef. These candles were a dull creamy gray. They had a low melting point and required constant snuffing of the wick to prevent them from smoking. The scent was slightly acrid, a reminder of the farm and the kitchen. But for the Christmas season, and especially in the vicinity of a masterpiece like the Christmas clock, the family would bring out the beeswax tapers. Beeswax was the luxury of the age. It burned with a clear golden flame and emitted the faint, sweet scent of honey and summer clover, a poignant contrast to the bitter frost outside the window. As Elias moves through the lower rooms, he sees these candles placed in Betty lamps or iron sconces reflected in the polished brass of the clock's pendulum. The light does not fill the room. It pools. It creates soft islands of visibility, leaving the corners of the room in a state of deep velvet shadow. This interplay of light and dark is hypnotic, the way a single flame dances in the draft, sending long, spindly shadows of the furniture across the wide planked floors. The rhythmic alchemy of the hearth. The hearth is the home's sun. On this Christmas Eve, it is a landscape of glowing embers and white ash. The boring history of 18th century cooking is a slow, methodical process that perfectly matches the ticking of the clock, suspended from the crane. The heavy iron arm built into the chimney is a cast-iron Dutch oven. Inside, a slow fermented dough of rye and Indian meal, cornmeal, is baking into anadama bread. The sound is a low, rhythmic bubbling from the stew pot, a liquid counterpoint to the clock's mechanical tick-tock nearby. On a trestle table, the aromatic preparations are underway. This is the sensory core of a colonial Christmas. There are no plastic decorations. There is only the earth, the pomanders. A bowl of oranges, rare treats brought by ship from the West Indies, sits on the table. The family members take whole cloves and press them into the orange skins in intricate geometric patterns. As the sharp, woody clove pierces the oily zest of the orange, a burst of citrus oil fills the air. This scent is a natural preservative, a time capsule of fragrance that will last until the spring. The spice grinding. A heavy mortar and pestle of lignum vitae wood is used to crush cinnamon sticks and whole nutmeg. The sound is a rhythmic thump grind. Nutmeg, in 1796, was so precious it was often kept in small silver boxes with built-in graters. The dust of the nutmeg hangs in the air, a warm, brown scent that seems to coat the back of the throat and settle the nerves. The drying racks, slices of apple and orange, are strung on linen threads and hung near the warmth of the fire. As they dehydrate, they curl into translucent amber-colored discs. They represent the preservation of summer, a way to keep the memory of the sun alive during the darkest night of the year. The social silence, the absence of noise. What is most striking about this Christmas is the silence. In the boring history of the 18th century, there were no recordings of music, no hum of motors, no chatter from a television. The human voice was the primary instrument of communication. Conversation in the keeping room is slow. People speak in the rhythmic cadence of the King James Bible or the Farmer's Almanac. They talk about the thickness of the ice, the state of the grain, and the predictability of the tides. It is a conversation about the real world, governed by the same physics that drive the clock in the way. The children are not playing with loud, plastic toys. They are playing with whirligigs, small wooden discs on a string that hum as they spin, or they are simply watching the fire. The fire is the original sleep story. The way the wood gasifies, releasing small jets of blue flame, and the way the logs settle with a soft, muffled thump as they turn to charcoal. The clock is the silent overseer. Even though the clock is tucked away in the attic, its presence is felt throughout the house. The 18th century mind was acutely aware of the hour. In a world without artificial alarms, the chime of the clock was the conductor of the household. As the candles burn lower, the equation of time we discussed in the previous chapter begins to manifest. The family knows that at midnight, the great return begins. The Christmas clock is more than a machine to them. It is a spiritual anchor. They believe that as long as the clock is wound and the 13th chime is prepared for, the house is in harmony with the heavens. Elias, looking at the remnants of these traditions, realizes that this boring history is actually a form of meditation. Every task winding the clock, dipping the candles, grinding the spices requires a slow-motion focus. There is no multitasking. You cannot grind nutmeg and read the news. You must be present with the nutmeg. You must be present with the gear. You must be present with the flame. The transition to the night as the last of the candles is snuffed using a silver cone. The room is plunged into the glow of the coals. This is a specific kind of light, a deep, pulsing crimson that provides just enough visibility to see the frost ferns on the windows. The smell of the room has evolved. The sharp citrus and spice have mellowed into a warm, resinous haze. The scent of the beeswax lingers like a ghost. Outside, the village of 1796 has vanished into the dark. The only thing moving is the seconds pendulum 2 floors above. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The clock is now the only living thing in the house. It is the guardian of the midnight hour. It is the bridge between the human traditions of the hearth and the celestial movements of the orrery dot as you listen to the rhythmic description of the colonial Christmas, the slicing of the oranges, the grinding of the spices, the slow melting of the wax. Let your own internal clock slow down. Your breathing is becoming as steady as the pendulum. The keeping room is a place of absolute safety. The fire is low, the blankets are heavy, and the great stillness of the 18th century is here to pull you into a deep, dreamless sleep. The preparations are complete. The spices are dried. The candles are snuffed. The world is waiting for the chime. Elias Thorne rests his lantern on a sturdy cedar beam, its light pooling around a small, leather-bound volume he discovered tucked into a secret compartment at the base of the clock. This is the Journal of the Silent Hours, the handwritten record of Master Johannes von Zeller. To the modern eye, it is an artifact. To Elias, it is a manual of patience. In the boring history of the written word, the physical makeup of a 16th century journal is as fascinating as its contents. This book is not made of wood pulp paper. It is composed of linen rag paper, a material made by macerating old clothes and flax fibers into a slurry, then pressing them into sheets. It has a heavy, textured feel, like a cross between fabric and stone. The edges are deckled, uneven and soft, showing the mark of the wooden frame used to scoop the pulp from the vat. The ink is iron gall ink. This was the standard for centuries. Created by mixing the tannic acid from oak galls, small growths on oak trees, with iron vitriol, ferrous sulfate. When first applied, the ink is a pale gray, but as it reacts with the oxygen in the air, it turns a deep, permanent, velvet black. Over the centuries, the acid in the ink has slightly etched into the paper, giving the handwriting a three-dimensional quality, as if the words were carved rather than written. The philosophy of the file, as Elias terms the pages. The script is a beautiful, rhythmic copperplate or secretary hand. He begins to read an entry dated November 14th, 1584. Today, I began the great wheel. I have selected a plate of rose brass, hammered to a thickness of exactly 3 millimeters. The sun has not shown its face for 3 days, and the forge fire is my only companion. To cut a gear is not to fight the metal. It is to invite the metal to become time. Von Zeller describes the painstaking process of filing. In the 1500s, there were no automated milling machines. To create a gear, the clockmaker first used a dividing engine, a primitive but precise brass circle with pre-calculated holes. He would use a scribe to mark the position of every tooth. For the great wheel of the Christmas clock, there are 96 teeth. Von Zeller records that he spent 14 hours on a single tooth. Imagine the technical repetition. He uses a needle file made of hardened steel. The motion is slow and rhythmic. Push, lift, push, lift. He must maintain a perfect $y angle to the plate. If the file tilts by even half a degree, the gear will bind and the clock will stop 100 years later. This is the boring history of precision, the understanding that a masterpiece is simply the sum of 1,000 perfectly executed, boring movements. The geometry of the palettes in a later entry. Von Zeller delves into the mathematics of the escapement palettes. He sketches a diagram in the margin, calculating the impulse angle required to keep the pendulum swinging. He writes about the need for a specific geometric curve to minimize friction. In modern terms, he was calculating the friction coefficient of the steel against the brass. He used a primitive form of trigonometry to ensure the drop of the escape wheel tooth was exactly $1 way circ dollar, where dollar, alpha dollar, and dollar, beta, a dollar, represent the entry and exit angles of the pallets, and dollar mu dollar represents the estimated friction of the whale oil. To achieve this, he did not use a calculator. He used a sector, a folding ruler with logarithmic scales. He describes the sound of the steel pallets being quenched in a bath of rosemary oil to harden them. a process that gave the metal a blue-black temper that would resist wear for centuries. The meditative state of the craftsman. The journal reveals that for von Zeller, clockmaking was a form of prayer. He describes the quietude of the Black Forest during the winter months. The snow is 6 feet deep against the workshop door. The world is silent. My breathing has slowed to match the swing of the test pendulum. I find that when I am filing the teeth of the brass, I no longer think of the hour. I am in the hour. The metal dust, the swarf falls like gold snow upon my workbench. It is a beautiful, useless waste that signifies progress. This is the core of the sleep story philosophy. It is the realization that time is not something to be spent, but something to be inhabited. The journal details the scent of the workshop. The linseed oil used to polish the wood, the charcoal, smoke from the small brazier, the ozone smell of the steel being filed, the sweet wax used to coat the blueprints, the secret of the star oil. As Elias nears the end of the journal, the entries become more mysterious. Von Zeller speaks of a star oil he used to lubricate the orrery gears. He claims it was a blend of ben oil from the seeds of the moringa tree and a precipitate of silver. In reality, this was likely an early experiment in solid lubricants. By suspending microscopic flakes of soft silver in a stable oil, von Zeller created a medium that would not gum up over decades of stillness. It is why, when Elias turned the key in the previous chapter, the gears moved with such eerie silence. The mystery was actually advanced 16th century. Material Science. The journal's final entry, the last page of the journal, is dated December 24th, 1591. The handwriting is shakier now, but the intent is clear. The Christmas clock is complete. Tonight, for the first time, the anniversary wheel will reach its notch. I have set the weights. The glass spheres are tuned to the frequency of the winter wind. I leave this book for the one who finds the clock in a time I cannot imagine. My advice to you, do not watch the hands. Listen to the heartbeat. The clock does not tell you what time it is. It tells you where you are. Elias closes the book. The leather is cool and dry. The iron gall ink has preserved von Zeller's thoughts for over 200 years, just as the rose brass has preserved his mechanics. A rhythmic close the attic is still. The only sound is the tick-tock of the clock, which now feels like a conversation between Elias and the long-dead master. The journal is a bridge of parchment and ink, connecting two centuries. As you listen to the details of the hand-filed gears and the scratching of the quill on the rag paper, let your mind drift into that 16th century workshop. See the swarf falling like gold dust. Hear the rhythmic push-lift of the file. Feel the weight of the leather-bound book in your hands. The master's work is done. The instructions are read. The gears are perfect. You are safe in the flow of a history that is long, slow, and deeply, beautifully boring. We return now to the very center of the mechanism, the place where the raw, chaotic energy of the falling lead weights is tamed and transformed into the orderly march of seconds. This is the escapement, the rhythmic heart of the Christmas clock. In the world of boring history, the escapement is the ultimate bridge between the physical laws of the universe and the human perception of time. It is a masterpiece of physics designed to produce a sound so repetitive, so predictable, and so steady that it acts as a metronome for the soul. The physics of potential energy. To understand the heart of the clock, we must first consider the two lead weights hanging in the dark belly of the cedar case. These weights represent potential energy, $P equals mgh$. As they hang suspended by their braided silk cords, gravity pulls at them with a constant unyielding force of $9.80 meters per second squared. Without the escapement, this energy would release all at once. The weights would crash to the floor, and the gears would spin in a blur of useless motion. The escapement is the brake and the release. It allows the weights to fall only a fraction of a millimeter at a time. This is the intermittent motion that defines mechanical timekeeping. Every tick you hear is a tiny giving in to gravity. And every tock is the machine catching itself before it falls too far. The anatomy of the tick-tock Elias. Thorn leans closer to the movement, his ear inches away from the brass plates. He begins to observe the deadbeat cycle in slow motion. The sound we hear as a single tick is actually a complex sequence of 3 distinct mechanical events. The lock, a tooth of the escape. Wheel the gear with the sharp. Hooked teeth strikes the flat face of the steel pallet. This produces the initial, sharp click. It is the sound of metal meeting metal under tension. The slide. As the pendulum continues its swing, the tooth of the wheel slides along the dead face of the pallet. Because the surface is polished with whale oil and bone dust, this movement is silent. But it is here that the clock holds its breath. The impulse, as the pendulum swings back toward the center. The tooth slips off the dead face and onto the impulse plane. For a microsecond, the weight of the lead pushes against the pendulum, giving it a tiny kick to keep it moving. This is the tock. This cycle repeats 3,600 times every hour, 86,400 times every day. In the Christmas clock, because the gears are made of rose brass and the pallets are hardened steel, the sound is not metallic or tinny. It is a deep, resonant thrum that carries the woody overtones of the cedar case. It sounds like the heartbeat of a giant, ancient creature sleeping in the rafters. The hypnotic symmetry of the pendulum. Escapement cannot function without its partner, the pendulum. In 1796, the pendulum was the most accurate way to divide time because of the principle of isochronism. Discovered by Galileo and refined by Christian Huygens, isochronism is the boring but miraculous fact that the time it takes for a pendulum to swing doesn't depend on how wide the swing is, only on the length of the rod, whether the clock is freshly wound or nearly run down. The tick and the tock remain perfectly spaced. This creates a temporal symmetry. For the listener, this symmetry is a powerful sedative. The brain, wired to look for patterns and threats, finds absolute safety in the clock's rhythm. There are no surprises, no skipped beats, only the relentless, mathematical certainty of the swing. Elias watches the pendulum bob, that 15-pound disc of brass and lodestone. It moves through the air with a laminar flow, meaning the air curves around its polished surface without creating turbulence. The silence of the swing is as important as the sound of the tick. It is the white space between the notes of a song, the microclimate of the gear, teeth. As we delve deeper into the boring history of this mechanism, we must look at the surface tension of the oil on the escapement teeth. Master von Zeller used a specific oil sink, a small, bowl-shaped depression in the brass plates to hold the lubricant. Through the lens of a magnifying glass, you would see that the oil forms a microscopic meniscus between the gear tooth and the pallet. As the tooth releases, the oil stretches and then snaps back, acting as a microscopic shock absorber. This prevents the metal from pitting or galling. The temperature in the attic is currently 28 degrees Fahrenheit, -2 degrees Celsius. In any other clock, the oil would have thickened into a sticky paste, causing the escapement to trip or shudder. But the whale oil in the Christmas clock remains fluid. Its molecular structure is such that it maintains its lubricity even as the frost grows on the outside of the case. This is why the heart of the clock continues to beat when everything else in the village has frozen solid, the resonance of the deadbeat. The deadbeat escapement was a revolutionary choice for the Christmas clock. Earlier, verge escapements had a recoil, meaning the second's hand would actually jump backward slightly with every tick. This created a frantic, nervous energy. The deadbeat, however, is a model of stoic progression. The wheel moves forward, then stops. Forward, then stops. There is no backward motion. There is no wasted energy. In the philosophy of the 18th century, this was seen as the rational way to live, always moving toward the future, one steady step at a time, without the friction of regret. Listening to this specific rhythm in the dark attic, Elias feels his own heart rate begin to synchronize with the clock. This is a biological phenomenon known as entrainment. When two rhythmic systems are in close proximity, the less powerful one will eventually match the frequency of the more powerful one. The Christmas clock, with its massive lead weights and heavy brass gears, is the conductor. Elias is the orchestra. The sleepy increments of the day, think of the day being divided into increments. Instead of a vast, overwhelming 24 hours, the clock breaks the day into 86,400 tiny, manageable pieces. Tick, a single grain of sand. Falls. Tock, a single breath is taken. Tick. Single snowflake settles on the roof. Tock, a single ember pops in the fireplace below. By focusing on the phycla. Micro time of the escapement. The macro time of the world's worries disappears. The 30,000-word history of this clock is contained within every single swing of the pendulum. All the alchemical blueprints, all the Black Forest winters, all the colonial traditions, they all converge in this one repetitive moment. As you drift toward the edge of sleep, let the science of the escapement be your anchor. Visualize the escape wheel with its 30 sharp teeth. See the steel pallets as they catch and release, catch and release. Feel the whale oil smoothing the way. There is nothing to do, nothing to solve, and nothing to change. The gravity is constant. The length of the pendulum is fixed. The rhythmic heart of the Christmas clock will continue to beat long. After you have surrendered to the night, the weights are high. The pallets are engaged. The heartbeat is steady. Tick. ... The journey of the Christmas clock from the deep, resinous shadows of the Black Forest to the frost-shattered coast of Massachusetts is a chronicle of slow history. In the late 18th century, a voyage across the Atlantic was not a matter of days, but a grueling, rhythmic passage of weeks and months, dictated entirely by the trade winds and the strength of hempen rope. To transport a delicate, astronomical instrument across 3,000 miles of salt spray and chaotic motion required a level of logistical patience that is almost unimaginable. In our modern age, the casket of fur and the salt damp air, the clock began its migration in 1772. Packed into the very silver fur crate, Elias Thorne now touched in the attic. But before it could reach the sea, it had to endure the land portage. It was carried on a heavy wooden axle wagon pulled by a team of 6 oxen. The boring history of this journey is found in the speed, 2 miles per hour. The oxen moved with a heavy, swaying gait that mimicked the swing of a pendulum. Every night, the merchant, a man named Thomas Thorne, who had purchased the clock from a bankrupt monastery, would check the crate's lashings. The greatest enemy of a clock is not time, but vibration. To protect the rose brass gears, Thomas had packed the internal cavities of the case with raw sheep's wool. This was an 18th century form of bubble wrap. The lanolin in the wool provided a secondary layer of moisture protection, while the dense fibers absorbed the jolts of the rutted European roads. When the clock arrived at the port of Rotterdam, it was loaded into the hold of a merchant brigantine named the Hesperus. In the 1770s, the hold of a wooden ship was a unique microenvironment. It was dark, humid, and smelled of pine tar, used to caulk the hull and bilge water. To prevent the salt-saturated air from corroding the brass, Thomas Thorne performed a ritual of atmospheric sealing. He melted a mixture of tallow and beeswax and ran it along the seams of the crate, creating a primitive but effective vacuum seal. The physics of the pitch and roll as the Hesperus entered the Western Ocean. The clock faced a new mechanical challenge: non-inertial reference frames. A pendulum clock is designed to work in a world where gravity acts in a straight, vertical line. On a ship, gravity is constantly shifting as the vessel pitches, tips forward and back, and rolls, tips side to side. Thomas Thorne knew that if the clock were allowed to run during the voyage, the pallets would strike the escape wheel with uneven force, potentially snapping the teeth. He did something that is a testament to the quiet hands of history. He dismantled the pendulum. He wrapped the 15-pound brass and lodestone bob in a chamois cloth and kept it in his own cabin, under his bunk, where the motion of the ship was least violent. The movement itself, the gears, the arbors, and the bone bushings remained in the hold. For 64 days, the Christmas clock was a silent machine. It existed in a state of suspended animation. Its heartbeat paused, while the wooden ribs of the ship groaned and shivered around it. Technical detail. The wood of the ship, mostly live oak and white pine, acted as a secondary case. Wood is a natural dampener of high-frequency vibrations. The low-frequency thrum of the ocean waves passed through the hull and into the crate. But the rose brass gears, nestled in their sheep's wool, remained unmoved. The survival of the Revolutionary War. The clock arrived in Philadelphia in the autumn of 1775. Just as the American colonies were fracturing away from the British Crown. This is where the secret voyage becomes a story of domestic resilience. During the British occupation of Philadelphia in 1777, the clock was seen as a potential source of strategic metal. Brass was a high-value commodity, often melted down to create buttons for uniforms or components for field cannons. To save the masterpiece, the Thorne family moved it once again. They disguised the clock case as a grain bin. They built a false wooden exterior around the cedar frame and filled the gaps with dried corn. For 2 years, the Christmas clock sat in a barn in rural Pennsylvania, hidden in plain sight. The quiet hands that kept it warm during this time belonged to Thomas's daughter, Abigail. She would enter the barn at night, reach through a hidden panel in the grain bin, and slowly turn the iron key. She didn't wind it to tell the time. There was no one to see the dial. She wound it because she believed that a machine of such precision would die if its gears remained stationary for too long. She was practicing the boring history of maintenance, the understanding that things last only because someone cares for them in the dark. The final passage to New England after the war. In 1789, the clock was moved one last time, north to the Massachusetts village where Elias now finds it. This journey was made by sleigh during the great winter of that year. The runners of the sleigh hissed over the hard-packed snow, a sound that Abigail noted in her diary as being as smooth as the slide of the clock's own pallets. The clock survived. The salt corrosion of the Atlantic crossing, the thermal shock of the Pennsylvania summers, the threat of smelting during the Revolution, the mechanical stress of being moved by wagon, ship, and sleigh. It survived because it was built with redundancy. Johannes von Zeller had designed the arbors with extra length to account for the settling of the wood. He had used rose brass that was hard enough to resist the pitting caused by humidity. But most importantly, it survived because of the human chain of horologist people like Thomas and Abigail, who understood that they were not the owners of the clock, but its stewards. The silent voyage of the mind Elias, tracing the scuff marks on the base of the clock, can see the history of transport etched into the wood. There is a dark stain where seawater once seeped into the hold of the Hesperus. There is a jagged scratch from a Continental soldier's bayonet. These are not defects. They are the biological markers of the clock's life. In the boring history of the world, we often focus on the battles and the kings. But the real history is the quiet movement of ideas and objects across the sea. It is the story of a 16th century German dream, surviving a 17th century war to reach an 18th century attic. As you lie in the quiet of your room, think of the secret voyage your own life takes through time. Think of the quiet hands that have supported you, the ancestors, the teachers, the builders of the houses you live in. You are part of a long, slow migration. The clock is no longer a traveler. It has reached its destination. The whispers across the Atlantic have settled into the quietude of the attic. The salt is gone. The sheep's wool is gone. The grain bin is gone. There's only the rose brass, the cedar, and the steady tick. The voyage is over. The clock is home. And you, listening to the story of its resilience, can finally allow your own lashings to loosen. The world is stable. The gears are safe. The long night is holding you steady, just as the hold of the Hesperus once held the heart of the Christmas clock. Sleep now, as the clock rests from its travels. The stars over the Atlantic are the same stars over your roof. Everything is connected by the slow thread of time. The house in the Massachusetts colony has reached its deepest point of stillness. It is the final hour of Christmas Eve. 1796. In the attic, Elias Thorne sits motionless, his back against the century-old timber of the roof, watching the Christmas clock fulfill its ancient purpose. The air is so cold it feels brittle, yet within the cedar case of the clock, there's a warmth of motion, a frictionless elegance that has survived the Black Forest, the Atlantic gales, and the passage of generations. The boring history of this final moment lies in the convergence of all the mechanical streams we have followed. The anniversary wheel, with its 365 teeth, has reached the final fraction of its final tooth. The Nautilus cam is at its absolute peak. Gravity, the silent conductor of this symphony, is pulling on the silver lead weight with a tension that has been building for an entire year. The midnight engagement, the 13th chime as the seconds hand made of blued steel sweeps toward the 12. A series of internal mechanical events occur with rhythmic, sleepy precision. First, there is the warning. In horology, this is the lifting piece, rising to unlock the strike train. It creates a soft metallic click, a sound that signals the machine is ready. Then, at the stroke of midnight, the 13th gear finally drops into its deep notch dot. This is the moment of the great release. The secondary weight falls. The carillon of glass begins to rotate. The sound is unlike any bell you have ever heard. Because the spheres are made of pressurized Meissen glass, they do not clang. Instead, they shimmer. As the velvet-tipped hammers strike the glass, the sound creates a resonant harmony that fills the attic. It is a chord composed of 12 distinct frequencies, tuned to the ancient Pythagorean scale. To the listener, the 13th chime is not a loud noise. It is a physical sensation. It is a low-frequency hum that vibrates the floorboards, the rafters, and the very bones of the house. It is a standing wave of sound that seems to suspend the passage of time. For these few minutes, the ticking stops being a division of the day and becomes a bridge to the eternal, the celestial alignment, as above, so below. Outside the small attic window, the New England sky is an obsidian mirror. The great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn is at its zenith. Through the orrery on the clock's face, Elias can see the porcelain planets reflecting this exact alignment. The physics of this moment are profound. The lodestone in the pendulum bob is reacting to the localized magnetic pull of the Earth. The clock is no longer just a machine in an attic. It is a sensory organ of the planet, recording the slow breath of the solar system. The snow has begun to fall again. But it is a silent, heavy snow, the kind that absorbs sound and turns the world into a vacuum of peace. Each snowflake is a unique, fractal crystal, falling in a terminal velocity that matches the slow, rhythmic swing of the clock's pendulum. The world outside is being tucked in by the frost, layer by layer, until the King's Highway, the village common, and the distant pine forests are all part of a single white tapestry. The deep slumber of history. Elias feels a heavy velvet weight pressing down on his eyelids. This is the historical slumber. It is the same sleep that claimed Johannes von Zeller in the Black Forest. It is the same sleep that Abigail Thorne felt as she wound the clock in the secret grain bin. It is a sleep that comes from the realization that we are part of something vast, orderly, and incredibly patient. In the boring history of time, we are but a single tick in the life of the universe. This thought is not frightening. It is the ultimate comfort. It means the world will keep turning without our effort. The gears will keep meshing. The seasons will keep returning. As the glass chimes fade into a long, shimmering decay, the clock returns to its primary rhythm. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The sound is now a lullaby. The scent of the cedar, the beeswax, and the whale oil has settled into a single grounding aroma. The blue hour has passed, the 13th chime has been struck, and the new year has begun its first quiet rotation. The final descent. You are now in the 18th century. You are wrapped in a heavy wool quilt, lying in a room warmed by the dying embers of an oak fire. The window panes are thick with frost ferns. The world is silent, save for that steady, golden heartbeat from the attic. The clock has done its work. It has survived the voyage. It has survived the wars. It has survived the centuries to bring you to this exact moment of peace. Imagine the pendulum swinging left, right. Imagine the rose brass gears turning slowly, surely. Imagine the snow falling silently, eternally. There is nothing left to do. The weights are high, the oil is fresh, and the stars are in their proper places. You are safe in the quietude of the frost. You are held by the history of the clock. Tick, tock, tick. As you drift away, the last thing you see is the glow of the porcelain earth on the clock's face. Turning, turning, always turning, into the deep, peaceful dark of the winter night. Sleep now. Sleep in the silence of 1796. Sleep under the ticking stars.